The fight against corruption globally is one that is always talked about, but in countries like Zambia, maybe with a little bit of frustration. Frustration because citizens feel a lot more can be done in the fight against graft. It is the most vulnerable in society that feel the impact of graft at the top leadership of any country. Today, Transparency International and Transparency International Zambia has been hosting the anti-corruption conference in Lusaka at the Intercontinental Hotel. I caught up with François Valerian, who is the chair of Transparency International, and I asked him the broader context of corruption and the African context of it. How can it work, and is the strategy working in Africa? This is This Day. My name is Dingindaba Jonah Buyoya. Mr. François Valerian, thank you so much for talking to us and welcome to Lusaka.
Thank you for your invitation.
We'll have to mention that we are at the Intercontinental Hotel in Lusaka. There's a lot of people that some have been a part of the ongoing conference and others just here for their own business. So that's because you might hear some of them in the background. But let's begin our interview. And I want to start off first of all with talking about a very important subject that affects a lot of people around the world. And this is an issue to do with corruption. The first question I want to ask you is in relation to the fact that a lot of people believe that corruption that should be focused on is corruption that has to do with political leaders. But what is the reality of what corruption looks like around the world?
Corruption of the political leaders is obviously a major issue in many countries, but it is part of a broader corruption, which is the global economy of corruption. Public money that is being stolen, public money that is being paid as bribes, all that money is being hidden in offshore centers or in various places and then invested in a few countries in the north with the complicity of enablers, of financial institutions, of various powerful individuals. So it's a global economy of corruption that we want to fight against.
When you look at the global economy of corruption, would you be of the considered view that the fact that it's a global economy makes it a lot harder to deal with? And if that's the case, how can countries around the world navigate this problem?
It is obviously difficult to address the global economy of corruption because it is a global challenge, like the global climate crisis or like the global health crisis a few years ago. And in front of those global challenges, the political world is extremely fragmented in various countries' government judiciary systems. That's the reason why we need international cooperation, and we also need what we have been those 2 days in Lusaka, Zambia, a global civil society with people, with activists from most African countries and non-African countries gathered to share information and best practice on how to address the global economy of corruption.
One of the things you will see that is regarded as the opportunities to deal with the global corruption economy has to do with Financial Intelligence Center, for example, an intelligence center that is connected to the Global Intelligence Center. Do you think that such initiatives are working at all in identifying financial crime and this corruption?
Economic intelligence, financial intelligence are obviously key, and what is key is to obtain the information, because the corrupt people are hiding and we want to find them and to find the money. And one of the tools that they are using in most instances is that they are hiding behind legal entities. And that is the reason why we want to know in every country who is behind the legal entities, what their names are, so that we know who owns a house, who owns a car, who owns a bank account, who has done a wire transfer. So that's essential that we have these registries working with sanctions against the legal entities that refuse to disclose their names. And that is true of all countries, in the north, in the south, because of the global nature of the problem.
When you look at, you say it's a global problem, but there's also this issue, this belief that corruption is a largely African problem, that a lot of this corruption that is talked about is very much prevalent in Africa. Is this true? And to what extent is it, if at all?
No, it is not true. And to me, by no means is corruption an African problem in that sense that it would be deeply rooted somewhere. I'm going to talk to you about my home country, which is France, as you can hear it. In France, we do not have a culture of integrity at all. What worked in France to combat a little bit corruption was fear of being jailed among the political leaders and among the bosses of corporations. So that's what worked. Enforcement of the laws. That is the key. So in most countries, in Africa and elsewhere, we now have a lot of things that could be written, laws, even international treaties. But what is lacking is enforcement by a judiciary system which is independent enough and resourced enough to be able to adequately prosecute corruption cases.
Do you think that that's the reason then that corruption is looked at from a political angle? The fact that there's laws that are put in place, there's a lot of legislation that is put in place, but the enforcement is where the problem comes in. And a lot of this enforcement relies on political leaders to make it effective. Do you think that's the reason why a lot of the corruption is attributed to political leaders?
Right, definitely, because the issue is political will. Corruption is abuse of power. So when we are talking about enforcement, we are really targeting the heart of the system, because it can be relatively easy to have laws adopted by a parliament, to have some regulations, even to sign and ratify treaties like the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. What is challenging to those that want to continue to abuse their power is to really enforce all that. It is to stop abusing their power. And they will stop abusing their power if we have enforcement.
Let's bring it down to Africa. I mean, we've talked about the broader context of the world, but the African continent, which we've touched on a little bit, and I've said, as I have said, is experiencing a lot of corruption. Some of the most poorly ranked countries, according to the Corruption Perception Index, are African countries. A lot of them are not well ranked when it comes to their fight against corruption. What does the political, what does the corruption landscape, I beg your pardon, look like on the African continent based on the research and information that you have as Transparency International?
I will start by talking about this ranking. So you're right about what you say about the ranking of many African countries. Now, this Corruption Perceptions Index that we are publishing every year, it is important because it shows how corruption in the public sector is being perceived. But it's only one part of this global economy of corruption. And this Corruption Perceptions Index does not produce a hierarchy between countries, with countries which would be better than others, because when you look at the countries which are best placed or ranked in this Corruption Perceptions Index and that are up north, those are the countries with the safe systems that attract the corrupt, because the corrupt know that their money will be safely invested in those countries, that all countries have to participate. Now, yes, there are problems in Africa, and the main problem is that we have this economy of corruption whereby public money may be stolen or bribes are paid in exchange for harm to common good. And then this money is taking the wrong routes, the routes of the colonial past up north to a few countries. So it's really extremely concerning, and there are probably $100 billions every year which are leaving Africa. So that's a concern. That's a concern that obviously has to be addressed primarily by the political leaders working with civil society in Africa, and also by the international community by attacking these enablers of those flows. Now, I mentioned civil society, and that's very important because in Africa and in other continents, the civic space is backsliding. There are more and more governments which are authoritarian governments. You have even a global narrative of a strong man who is able to solve everything. There have been coups in Africa, and to us, the solution to the abuse of power is not to concentrate power more, because when you concentrate power, you also concentrate abuse of power.
When you talk about the Corruption Perception Index, which I'd like us to look at in the context of Africa, is that first of all, we start off by acknowledging the fact that it is a perception, isn't it? It's a perception.
It's definitely a
but
perception.
To what extent would you say it's got an influence on how a country is going to fight corruption and how its citizens are going to respond?
I think it has an influence on how a country is fighting corruption. Let's take the example of Zambia. Zambia has made a very significant progress this year in the Corruption Perceptions Index, with an increase of 12% of the score of the previous year. And this increase is probably, according to Transparency International Zambia, which is our national chapter in Zambia, this increase is due to the improvements in the institutional and legislative framework in Zambia to combat corruption, and also an acknowledgement of the fact that these institutional bodies are effectively working with civil society to fight against corruption.
Do you think that the perception has the potential to discourage the fight of corruption? And is it true that it can be inaccurate sometimes, that the perception of corruption of a specific country does not truly reflect what the true picture of corruption looks like in that country?
Well, the Corruption Perceptions Index is not math or an exact science. It is an average that we calculate every year of between 6 and 12 various sources of think tanks, various institutes, about each of the 180 countries that are measured, covered by this index. So it is not, again, a science which would measure exactly a level of corruption, but it gives the view of various sources about the state of corruption in the public sector in a country. It definitely has to be complemented by the view of the civil society organizations in that country, among them our national chapters. When we have national chapters, we have national chapters in approximately 100 countries worldwide.
Do you think that it's important also for governments to take interest in this and also give their own analysis of what's going on, even if in this case they are the ones that are being evaluated?
The launch of the Corruption Perceptions Index every year is a great opportunity for civil society and governments and companies to have a dialogue on how didn't work, on how did work, on how the situation can improve. So definitely the government has things to say, and it's fully normal, and the civil society organizations as well. And it's this fruitful dialogue that we encourage. We are always in a critical stance to power because we criticize abuse of power. So we are not linked to a political or an economic power, but we want, and since our birth, we are a 31-year-old movement. We are founded in 1993. Since our birth, we are working with all well-intended stakeholders, governments included, when they are genuine in their fight against corruption.
You have talked a lot about the public sector, and I've also acknowledged that that's what a lot of people focus on. They want to know where their money is going, what their political leaders are doing. But you also said at the start of this interview that it's a global economy of corruption, and some of the players in this corruption are not from the government. They are private citizens, sometimes very powerful private citizens, sometimes ordinary citizens. How important is it, first of all,
is it for us to also look at the other side of this, that private citizens play a huge role in driving corruption or stopping it?
Well, there are various kinds of private citizens, and I would like to start speaking about the victims of corruption, because there are innumerable private citizens who are victims of corruption, starting with the women, the weakest, the poorest, who are the most exposed to corruption. So yes, these persons are exposed to corruption and they are suffering from corruption. Now you have other private citizens who are wealthy, powerful. You have a lot of wealthy and powerful people who also are honest people, but you have other people who are not honest people and who are always trying to increase their power and wealth by all means. One of those means being buying political power during elections. And there are a lot of elections. There will be a lot of elections this year on all continents. It's called the super election year. And we are very concerned that in many countries, political power is for sale and is being purchased by private interests. Now, those are the private citizens, but we also have the companies, the corporations, which may also bribe and which may have partners in various countries who are still bribing governments, officials, civil servants, in spite of all the conventions signed, in spite of all the laws that are being signed, because the sanctions are not deterrent enough.
Where does this leave the private citizens that are suffering from this corruption, that are victims of this corruption, when some of the examples you've cited sound like people that should protect these private citizens that are victims of corruption? Where does all of this leave them?
They definitely need to be protected, these victims of corruption. And what is really tragic with these victims of corruption, that not only are they suffering in their daily lives, not only are women in many instances forced to sextortion, to sexual extortion, but this global economy of corruption is transforming these victims of corruption into useless people, people without an economic use, fishermen who are losing their job because you have big fishing companies which have bribed, like it was the case in Namibia with an Icelandic company, so that fishermen lose their jobs, or populations that have to leave their livelihoods. So these persons are completely expelled from the economy. So we need to have them back into the economy through integrity in political power, and through the voice of the civil society organizations. These persons may be considered as useless by the economy of corruption, but they are not voiceless, and their defenders are not voiceless, and their defenders need to be able to speak up in a free civic space.
When you look at corruption and the fight against corruption around the world, to what extent do you think it is important that the local people, that the local governments are integrated in the fight against corruption? And I'll explain what I mean. For example, in a country like Zambia, how significant is it that the people are integrated in the fight against corruption, as opposed to the fight against corruption being driven by the donors, for example, the countries that are donating to poorer countries like Zambia? How significant is it for people who are victims of this corruption to play a role in fighting it?
It is essential in every country that the citizens control the exercise of power, which means that the citizens have an essential role to play in the fight against corruption. The fight against corruption cannot be the thing of the power only, or the donors only, or the international community. It won't work if the citizens are not engaged. The citizens need to be at the table every time there are discussions between governments and donors, between governments and companies, between governments and other governments. Every time a decision is made that impacts civil society has to be present at the table and has to have its say.
Do you think that the fight against corruption in African countries like Zambia has been slow because the victims and the ordinary citizens are not actively involved, and it's much talk with the leaders themselves and the international community?
I think that the citizens in Zambia are actively involved in the fight against corruption through civil society organizations like Transparency International Zambia. I think that things are progressing in the good direction, at least in Zambia. There are other countries when you have no democracy at all, when you have dictatorship, so it's obviously much more difficult and extremely dangerous for civil society organizations to speak up. But there are countries such as Zambia where citizens are being heard, and when citizens are being heard, they have to speak up.
And what lessons would you say can be drawn from countries? Because I mean, I'll come to talk about Zambia, but you've talked about it quite a number of times and how we're making progress. But there's also countries that seem to be doing better. What lessons would you say a country like Zambia needs to draw from countries in Africa that are performing better?
I think that I'm not sure that there are lessons to be taken from other countries. I would not use the word lessons. I would use the word exchange of experiences between countries. And I will give you an example. 10 days ago, I was in Latin America for a similar conference of all our chapters from the American continent as a whole. And we were discussing those exact matters and the importance of all the citizens in the control over the exercise of power. So every time we have openness of the government, every time the government is ready to share information, to facilitate access to information, which is crucial to the citizens, we make progress in the fight against corruption. Access to information is key because information is the raw material of civil society to control abuse of power.
Let's talk about Zambia. The latest corruption perception index score gave Zambia 37 for 2023. The ranking is 98 among 180 countries, and this certainly reflects some of the initiatives that are being put in place. But what exactly attributes, or should I ask that, do you think, or have you evaluated based on the research that has been done, that this has a direct correlation in the change of regime that happened in this country in 2021, because we've had a different government since that year?
Well, I will let Transparency International Zambia comment on the details of the Zambia political evolution. What I can say is that, as I said, it is not an exact science, so there is no direct correlation between this average of sources and any type of particular event. Our chapter's analysis, so TI Zambia's analysis of this increase in the corruption perceptions index in Zambia, it is that it has to do with an improved institutional and legislative framework to fight against corruption, with still a number of things to improve that are being detailed by Transparency International Zambia.
One of the results of this crusade in fighting corruption, one of the results of this fight against corruption has been a lot of people that are wealthy in the country, and I'm talking about Zambia, and aspirational citizens feeling like it's a crime to be wealthy, and that once you earn some money, you become a target. How do we guard against this thought and not create the impression that citizens must not succeed, and the moment they succeed, then the law enforcement will follow them and accuse them of corruption?
It is a crime to be dishonest. It is not a crime to be wealthy. That's my single answer. We are not fighting against the wealthy. We are fighting against those that abuse their power to become wealthier or more powerful.
Do you think that there is an impact on corruption when political leaders use the fight against corruption to target political opponents?
It is really concerning that the fight against corruption can be used, manipulated for political objectives. So we know that there is an anti-corruption narrative that can be abused of, exactly as political leaders may abuse their powers. And here they are selling false promises to the people to be elected and then to act in the wrong way. And yes, they are threatening the fight against corruption by doing that. And we try to be always very attentive to those things, because we can't, political leaders cannot promise to fight corruption and then not deliver at all, or deliver the contrary, deliver more corruption.
To what extent is this a problem around the world? You know, this false, or politically motivated corruption fight, and what impact does this have on the actual fight against corruption?
It is obviously a problem because in many countries, the fight against corruption is very high up on the electoral agenda on each election. And then we have elections, and in many cases, the situation does not change or does not improve. And the result of that is that many citizens are disillusioned, and they are even desperate, and they think that nothing works, and then they are attracted by this rhetoric of the strong man, or by rhetoric of people who are explaining that fighting the neighbor is better than working with the civil society, and that's very dangerous for democracy.
And then as we get towards the conclusion of our interview, how do we improve the fight against corruption globally? But I also would like us to look at how we can link the global corruption fight to individual countries and how we can make it work.
The link with what's happening within every individual country is a very important link, because when public money is missing, when public money is lacking for delivering public services or paying decently public servants, you have created a vacuum, and then those public servants are selling dysfunctional services for bribes. So there is an obvious link between the corruption that we observe on the street, on the daily life of the citizens, and the global corruption. Now, what matters is this international cooperation between judiciary systems, between civil society organizations from various countries, and within the country, the cooperation between the government and the civil society.
Finally, do you think that, and I'm citing an example of a country like Zambia, because Zambian presidents enjoy immunity from prosecution once they're in office, and indeed after office, unless the immunity is stripped off, only when they're out of office. In a transparent society, one that encourages the fight against corruption, one that encourages honesty, is this an ideal law, or does it make it harder for people to trust the government and for a president and his government to be transparent?
I'm afraid I'm not an expert in Zambian law or constitution,
or in any other country.
Comment on that. Generally speaking, immunity may raise problems. Now, I respect every country's tradition, but the less we have immunity, the less we have impunity as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for your questions.
Welcome back. You're watching This Day. Now, Zambia, like many other African countries, is grappling with the scourge of corruption. And you heard from the interview that we had earlier talking about the broader context of the fight against corruption from the perspective of the world, the African continent, and Zambia. There have been many calls that have been brought forward by stakeholders and citizens alike to curb this vice. In 2023, Zambia did score 37 on a scale from 0, which means highly corrupt, to 100, which means very clean, on the Corruption Perception Index, which signifies a huge turnaround in how the country deals with corruption. Recently, today, in Lusaka, Transparency International Zambia President Priscilla Chikonde Chanza said despite the country recording this score on the index, there's an even greater call for the fight against corruption. We were there and we bring you highlights of what was talked about at this briefing on this edition of This Day.
Thank you so much. This week, Zambia had the pleasure of hosting our very first Africa International Anti-Corruption Conference in Lusaka. The event, which has gathered 113 delegates from 36 nationalities from all over the continent and beyond, is meant to serve as a regional platform to discuss ideas, achievements, challenges, and share best practices and recommendations among anti-corruption activists in Africa. This event is the lead up to the 21st International Anti-Corruption Conference, which will take place this June in Venice, Lithuania. Let me start by stating that it was with great pride that we first received the request to organize this event by the ISCC team. We consider this to be a significant show of trust in our capacities and appreciation for the work that we carry out at Transparency International Zambia. I would like to express a word of appreciation to the chair of TI, François Valerian, and the CEO of TI, Daniel Eriksson, and the other colleagues from the TI movement who joined us for this important event, including Kay, our vice chair. I also want to thank the chair of the ISCC Council, our fellow countryman, Mr. Ruben Lifuka, for the support received and for the leadership he continues to provide at the global level. Thanks to the valuable contributions by the many panelists and moderators which have led the discussions during these last 2 days. We have delved with great depth into different topics under the overarching theme, Standing Up for Integrity in Africa. Allow me therefore to unpack for you some of the main takeaways from this Africa ISCC. Corruption is a global phenomenon. Public funds are embezzled, transferred abroad, typically to the global north, converted into vehicles and goods, and stored in safe havens. Indeed, it is very rare to observe today a purely national manifestation of corruption. Even when we look at the most basic petty episodes of corruption, which are unfortunately on everyday occurrence for most Africans, the links with the global dimensions are strong. It is the very lack of resources that no one side constitutes a push for public servants to demand bribes, and on the other creates a vacuum for individuals to exploit. Corruption is global, and the solution must therefore be global. It is crucial that we don't limit ourselves to our own individual spheres of actions, but that we come together at the regional and global level and discuss strategies and opportunities for addressing this scourge. Together, we can define common global as well as specific regional trends, threats, and the needed responses. The fight against corruption cannot be left to the government alone. As civil society, we are called to a higher standard to occupy maybe the most important role in this fight. The space for action for CSOs in Africa is increasingly restricted by governments scared of the mounting popular demand for accountability and transparency. CSOs, media houses, and individuals are increasingly targeted through threats, arrests, assassinations, and abuse of public order laws in what has become an alarming quest for silence and consensus, exacerbated by the rise in authoritarianism on the continent. As our TI chair, Professor Valerian, rightfully highlighted, information is our raw material, our most important weapon. By sharing information, experiences, and best practices, we can keep up with the constantly evolving challenges brought by the global economy of corruption and improve our effectiveness. Indeed, this is the nature and objective of the present conference. Several topics were discussed, in depth in order to identify solutions and recommendations. Number 1, African democracies are currently experiencing their fiercest challenge since the 1990s. With the rise in coups in the Sahel, the increase in the conflicts in the region, the persistence of kleptocratic regimes, and the reversal of democratic processes in many countries. This development entails a growing window of opportunity for criminals and corruption enablers, such as corrupt public officials, to bend the rules and abuse public power. It is vital that anti-corruption actors convene, rethink, and reshape their strategies to adapt to the growing and democratic pushes across the continent. Electoral integrity has also been an important element on our agenda. Few elections in Africa can stand the quality test. Stakeholders should do more to evaluate and assess the weak points in the process in order to reduce the trust deficit in the electoral process. It is civil society's responsibility to participate in this process and advocate for the needed changes. Number 2, African countries should put in place legal frameworks that allow for asset declaration and lifestyle audits to enhance public accountability. We recognize that the lack of transparency around declaration of assets for public institutions links back to issues of kleptocurrency and state capture on the continent. The range of these phenomena is so pervasive that, quoting Professor Thuli Madonsela, former public protector of South Africa, when spider webs combine, they can tie up a lion. Number 3, sextortion might be the most difficult form of corruption to tackle and detect. Sextortion is not considered a crime in many African countries and quite possibly deemed as a taboo to discuss openly. Reporting cases of sextortion is especially difficult due to fear of reprisals or social pressures and culture. Anti-corruption activists must begin to raise awareness about sextortion and its dimensions. In addition, stakeholders should scale up efforts to mainstream gender across anti-corruption interventions and effectively address this issue. Number 4, corruption exerts a huge burden on our environment. Environmental resources such as forests, fisheries, and wildlife are exploited every day to the advantage of a few corrupt individuals. It is our environment and our future that pay the price. As one of our panelists put it yesterday, corrupt decisions taken now can have a destructive impact years from now. These processes further exacerbate socio-economic inequalities that affect many African countries. Recommendations to contain the spread of environmental corruption include, among others, the creations of coalitions and synergies between anti-corruption and environmentalist actors, outreach activists targeting stakeholders outside of the anti-corruption arena, the creation of a nexus including environmental sectors, land and extractive industries through a human rights lens in addition to the use of corruption risk assessments. Number 5, by providing new avenues and options for criminals, technology has become a growing threat in the fight against corruption. Cybercrime is on the rise, and artificial intelligence is providing a new arsenal to cybercriminals. As we adapt our research and monitoring approaches to take into account the ways in which technology facilitates corrupt practices, we should also look into leveraging the new set of opportunities that technology offers, both concerning evidence generation and advocacy. CSOs should strengthen data capacity, explore linkages and collaboration opportunities with tech companies, promote transparency and open data, and deploy tech solutions in research and advocacy. This conversation is particularly significant for the African context, where technology is often celebrated for its potential to leapfrog development. And lastly, the protection of activists, journalists, and whistleblowers has been a recurring theme throughout the conference. Recent years have been among the most dangerous for these heroes of anti-corruption. Looking at our societies in Africa, it is crucial that we push for reform and for the meaningful implementations of provisions to protect those who have courage to speak up, without whom we would not be able to pursue our fight. Ladies and gentlemen, the Africa IACC has infused renewed motivation and energy in our mission to fight corruption. It was an honor to welcome to Lusaka so many international delegates from Africa and the world, and a privilege to discuss with all participants strategies, experiences, best practices, and opportunities. While recognizing the mounting pressure of the challenges we face as anti-corruption activists, our action will grow in size and effectiveness if we unite our voices and coordinate our efforts. Quoting the IACC Chair, Ruben Lifuka, we hope this is just the beginning of a lasting process of cross-country cooperation and dialogue at a continental level, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue at the Global IACC in June. With these few remarks, I thank you.
Thank you for watching tonight's edition of This Day. My name is Dingindaba Jonah Buyoya. Good night.